Hello, welcome to my living room. This is my introduction to Engage for Excellence. The purpose of this is to tell you kind of where this course came from and make sure that you've done the appropriate background reading before you start trying to learn this course. So, basically, I suppose this course was designed to provide something for leaders and managers who most often struggle with motivating their teams and keeping them engaged. The main reason for this is that although performance tends to be measured quite well in terms of KPIs, that only gives you a very small part of the picture. And the purpose of Engage for Excellence is to look at the 5 key strands that actually sort of affect how people thrive and flourish within an organisation, within their life in general. So although this is very much written with leaders and managers in mind, the actual content is quite malleable. You can work with pretty much any group talking about this stuff. The more background you know about it, the easier that is. It's all based, as I said, I think, on Martin Seligman's work. Martin Seligman being one of the founding fathers, that's the dog, one of the founding fathers of positive psychology. So essentially, his background was he worked in mental health disorders. He worked predominantly with things like depression and long-term mental illness. And his interest in human flourishing came from a study that he conducted with learned helplessness in dogs. Now, learned helplessness, if you have a look at the notes that are attached to this file, is essentially the idea that people can learn to be dependent on others and can stop understanding that they have control over their environment or their situations. What he discovered, though, when he was working with these dogs was that there were some of them that just wouldn't give up. It was like they were incapable of depending on others for anything. And this led him to really begin to think about, well, why is that? Why do some of us give up? Why do some of us keep on going and trying? And from this, he essentially deduced that psychology is kind of a half-baked science. And what he means by that is we have studied mental illness incredibly thoroughly. There are 5 versions of the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, for sort of different mental health disorders, and we can diagnose all different sorts of things, from autism to child development disorders to schizophrenia and everything in between. But only about 23% of the population are actually affected by these sorts of disorders. So his real question was, does the absence of mental ill health mean that you are mentally healthy? So essentially, what about the other 77% of us? Just because we've not ticked a box on some form somewhere that says that we're clinically depressed, does that mean that we are effectively coping with the situation that we live in? So in order to get some of this background, there's a bunch of reading I recommend that you do before you go any further on trying to learn this course. At the very least, you should have read this book here, which is Flourish by Martin Seligman. If you haven't read this book, then you're not allowed to do any of the other videos until you have, okay? Because there's so much background in that book that without that basis, then you'll probably find some of this a little bit difficult to relate to. Other things I recommend that you read are Martin Seligman's What You Can Change and What You Can't, which basically looks at the control that we have over different aspects of our life. So looking at, even if we use, say, stress as an example, what are the things that we stress about that we have control of? Not necessarily in terms of silly stress, but I'm talking about there are things that we stress about in terms of, I don't know, restructures within an organisation that are out with our control. Us choosing to spend time stressing out about those things isn't actually particularly helpful. It's detrimental to your health, it's detrimental to your ability to do the job that you're trying to do. Whereas there are things that when we stress out about them, they actually can't help. Thing is, if we choose to stress out about something that we have control over, but choose not to do anything about it, then we essentially make our own stress levels worse. So it's really about finding ways of acting on those sort of stressful situations. The other book I would recommend you read is Authentic Happiness by Martin Seligman. This is kind of the groundwork to Flourish. Flourish essentially takes the theory that he begins to build and expands on it. Some people say that it rubbishes the theory. That's not true at all. What it does is it builds on certain aspects of the theory, because it looks at the idea that people work and think at their best when they are using certain character strengths. I even recommend that you go and do the VIA character strengths questionnaire just to find out a little bit about yourself, so that you can then talk about this when you're working with different audiences. I will attach that to this file as well so that you can find that. But if you haven't done, as I say, at the very least having read Flourish, then you're not allowed to do any more. Okay, so go and do that just now, and I will see you soon. Hello. Right, so if you're back, I am assuming you have now read Flourish. If you're not, you're a bad person and you should go and read Flourish. But whether you have or not, I will keep going anyway. So, obviously from reading Flourish, you will have developed an understanding of the PERMA theory in general. Before I start talking about what PERMA is, when I'm delivering this course, I actually start off by introducing Martin Seligman and a little bit of his background, and then begin by talking about learned helplessness. Now, learned helplessness is essentially the theory that we can learn to be helpless. Some sort of really obvious examples of this are things like drug or alcohol addiction, but Martin Seligman's interest in learned helplessness actually came from a study that he did with dogs when he was working in the field of mental health. What he realised when he was working with this particular group of dogs, that regardless of how well or badly they were treated, there were some dogs who wouldn't give up. So a lot of them would learn to either shy away from sort of more challenging handlers, or they would have to act in a certain way in order to get food and realise that actually nothing they really did would impact that, whereas some dogs just didn't give up. And Martin Seligman's real question was, well, why do some of them not give up? What is it about that particular character that made them different from the rest of them? So from this he started to look at, well, if we apply this to human psychology, why do we have some members of our population who give up very easily or who fall into these sort of dependent relationships, and others who don't? And if we can learn to be helpless, surely we can learn to be optimistic. For a bit more background on that, read his book Learned Optimism, or listen to the audiobook or something, and it'll give you a bit of background on what learned optimism really is. It's not just being sort of blindly hopeful, it's all about being realistically optimistic. So thinking within the parameters of your capability, what are you actually capable of achieving if you choose to apply yourself to it? And how do we make that happen? When I'm talking about learned helplessness, though, I also use a couple of slightly less serious anecdotes, like I talk about Ross, for example, having certain traits that he has learned to be not very good at. So things like wrapping presents. He will deliberately wrap presents badly in front of me because he knows if he does it badly enough, I will do it for him. That kind of thing. So it's worth finding a slightly humorous anecdote of learned helplessness as well, just to lighten the mood a little bit. But if you have a little read of some of the learned helplessness stuff that's available online, just Google it, you'll find a million things, then I'm sure you'll start to build your own version of what these things look like. Okay, so a little bit of kind of PERMA general background. PERMA is a 5-strand theory which is basically the science of human flourishing. So it's called the PERMA theory because it sounds nice and because basically it's made up of 5 different things. The P stands for positive emotion, the E stands for engagement, the R for relationships, the M for meaning, and the A for accomplishments. The way that I tend to deliver this course means that each of those 5 sections are actually quite flexible in terms of what order they go in. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to take you through them from P to A, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I would deliver it in that order. The way I choose what order I'm going to deliver this in tends to come from discussions with Emma or with the client in order to discover exactly what their motivations for the course are and also what it is that they're trying to get out of it, really. Just depending on their specifications, the way that it actually sort of forms a full course can change. But the purpose of this is to give you a little bit of background on each one so that you can start to build your own bank of knowledge and stories that are related to this scientific theory, because the thing that makes Martin Seligman's approach to kind of happiness and flourishing and well-being better, in my opinion, than others is the fact that it's not just a self-help theory. It is a scientifically tested theory. He uses scientific method through a wide range of different approaches. So he uses a huge amount of questionnaire studies, he uses a huge amount of observation studies, he does qualitative and quantitative research in order to develop this theory. Now, the area of positive psychology is actually still very young. So in terms of comparing the body of data that we have, there's only about 10 to 15 years worth of data in this particular area, whereas in sort of mainstream psychology of sort of mental ill health, we're looking at almost 100 years worth of data. So this is still a very young science, which means it is still developing. So even stuff I'm talking about right now, although it might be relevant just now, it doesn't mean that in 6 months to a year there won't be a completely new theory that's come and blown it out of the water. So part of I suppose, everything that we do is really trying to keep on top of that side of things as well. But what I'm going to do is I'll take you through the 5 different aspects one by one, starting with positive emotions. So, positive emotions. This is the P of the PERMA theory and is quite often one of the starting points for this course. It's quite a nice place to start because when we start talking about positive emotions, it actually starts us off in terms of thinking about some quite nice stuff, because positive emotions are associated with more pleasurable things in life, times in your life where you're happier, where you feel more fulfilled, and quite often are quite synonymous with flow, which links very nicely into engagement, which is the second part, which we'll come on to later. What I want to be crystal clear about right at the beginning is when I'm talking about positive emotions, I'm not just talking about happiness. And the reason I say that is because happiness as a word, particularly within modern day culture, has an awful lot of stigma attached to it. So it's quite synonymously used with things like cheerfulness. And there's actually a big distinction between happiness and cheerfulness. So I prefer to talk about either hedonic happiness or eudaimonic happiness. Hedonic happiness is basically the pleasure-seeking side of happiness. So we are looking at how do people act in ways to increase levels of pleasure and purely pleasure that they experience in their life. And the real question when it comes to hedonic happiness is it actually fulfilling? Is it long lasting? Is it sustainable? If we use things like drug addiction as an example here, the high that you get when you partake in some sort of drug, whatever it may be, I'm not particularly experienced in that kind of thing, so I don't really know, but the high that is reported is one of intense pleasure. It's not necessarily one of intense happiness, it's one of intense pleasure. And the challenge with experiencing something intensely pleasurable is you then crave it again. The thing is, it's very difficult to replicate that high, so it takes either more of that drug or more of that thing in order to replicate a similar level of pleasure. So you can relate this to celebrity culture. The number of celebrities that you see go off the rails after very successful careers early on tends quite often to relate to the level of sort of pleasure-seeking behaviour. If they're used to fame and adoration, and say that starts to fizzle out for whatever reason, they may go and look for that elsewhere, which is why you get so many car crashes, essentially, of people who just go off the rails because they look for that form of pleasure in something else. And as I say, the challenge with hedonic happiness is that it habituates very quickly, in that you stop getting that buzz very quickly. So it's very short-lived. And if you actually watch Martin Seligman's TED Talk on the good life, then you'll start to really be able to tease out the differences between a sort of pleasurable approach to life and a eudaimonic approach to life. Eudaimonic happiness comes much more from the traditional kind of philosophical view of happiness, in that in order to be happy, we must be fulfilled. We must be able to find meaning in our lives. We should be able to improve other people's lives in what it is that we're doing. So eudaimonic happiness essentially comes down to how much meaning and value you derive from what it is that you're doing. So if you put this into a work context, if you have somebody who is working incredibly hard for a company that they absolutely love, in which they share their values with, chances are their levels of eudaimonic happiness or pleasure that they derive from working in that environment are going to be higher. So if we could ideally have that in every single employee that ever worked in every organisation, then it would be a really happy place. The thing is, that's not often the case. You get some members of your staff, that's a dog coughing by the way, not me. You get some members of staff who are really highly engaged in what it is that they're doing, but you also get ones at the other end of the spectrum who are there purely for the paycheck. So from a managerial point of view, actually being able to increase that level of positive emotion in the workplace and that level of meaning in the workplace can help us increase staff engagement. So I suppose the real reason I start off quite often with positive emotions is to draw that distinction right at the beginning. Regardless of how I then talk about either positive emotions or whatever order the rest of the course comes in, the idea that there's a difference or a distinction between hedonic happiness, that pleasure-seeking happiness, and eudaimonic happiness, the sort of happiness where we feel fulfilled in our lives, is really the starting point for this. So positive emotions. Once we've sort of cleared up the difference between the different types of happiness, being eudaimonic happiness and hedonic happiness, I then go on to talk about, well, what are the different sorts of positive emotions we experience, because it's not just black and white. You don't just feel happy or you feel sad. There is a huge spectrum of positive emotions in between. So this can range from joy to interest to love to hope. Hope's an interesting one actually, because hope almost has a negative connotation, but when used in context, being hopeful about something is actually a positive emotion, but don't worry too much about that. So still random little tangent. But there's a massive range of positive emotions, and in the supporting document that goes along with these videos, there's a list of probably about 25, 30 different positive emotions. Now, when I'm delivering the course, I don't talk about all of those different positive emotions. What I do is I tend to pick out the ones that are most relevant to the client to put it into context for them. So one of the challenges that clients often come to us with is the fact that there's maybe a lack of morale or a lack of motivation within their teams. Sometimes it can be just a poor culture in terms of the ethos and the ethics that kind of go on behind the scenes. And a lot of that can come down to how it actually feels to be in that working environment. Because how you feel essentially impacts the level of emotion that you experience. So sometimes your positive emotions or your level of emotional experience can be impacted just by having somebody that you don't really like sit beside you. The thing is, although that might seem like quite a small thing, over time that can build and build and build and can have quite a negative impact on how you think and how you feel about yourself when you're at work. So essentially the purpose of talking about positive emotions is to help people identify, well, how do you actually feel when you're at work? And why do you feel that way? So if you come into work every single day and you hate it, why do you hate it? Is it because you don't identify with what it is the organisation's trying to achieve? Or is it that there's something else, either in work, out with work, that is impacting the way that you think and feel about yourself? And once we kind of help people identify, well, what is their starting point? What is their baseline level of happiness? Then we can start to think about, well, how do you actually build and develop this? Quite often, this is where positive emotions, once again, are really closely linked to meaning, which I'll come back to later on, is often a lack of positive emotion can actually be a sign that people don't identify with the vision or the values of the organisation. So it's quite important to kind of drop that in there at that point, just to get them thinking, well, do I feel like that because I don't identify with this organisation, or is it because there's a particular relationship within this team that isn't working well for me, or something like that? Am I not being able to progress? In fact, even if you listen to those things, relationships within team, ability to progress, meaning, then it essentially, positive emotion is impacted by all of the other aspects of PERMA. So that's again why it's quite a nice place to start. When it comes to boosting positive emotion, there are kind of three key things that I talk about. One is random acts of kindness and how we can actually implement them in the workplace in a way that's kind of not cheesy but quite effective. Then I talk about gratitude and how we express gratitude and the importance of expressing gratitude. And there's something else that I talk about as well that I can't actually quite remember just now, but I'm sure it'll come back to me while I am filming this bit of the course anyway, because I'm not starting again just because I forgot that bit. I start off by talking about random acts of kindness. The reason I talk about random acts of kindness is because everybody kind of knows what they are. Over the last few years, random acts of kindness have kind of exploded through things like Facebook and that kind of thing. And people are aware of what it means to be nice to somebody else. So, the other one's praise. I'll come back to that later on. So to start with that, it's like I tend to just use whatever's happened most recently. At the time of filming this, one of the recent random acts of kindness that has been all over particularly the Scottish press, was when somebody paid somebody's parking ticket outside Sick Kids and left a note saying the last thing you need to be worrying about is a parking ticket when you potentially have an incredibly ill child right now. And off the back of that, the person who received that payment set up a Just Giving page and raised over £10,000. So it's essentially this idea of pay it forward. In fact, it's worth maybe watching Pay It Forward or a few of the other links that are available on Random Acts of Kindness. And then it's about, well, how do we perform these in the workplace? They don't need to cost a lot of money. Sometimes it can be buying somebody a cup of coffee. Sometimes it can actually just be taking the time to listen and see why somebody's actually upset about something. And the other thing that I talk about at this point is how often we actually say thank you. Because quite often we apologise for things. We're very quick to say sorry. But how often do we actually thank people for things that they've done? It's very easy to apologise for something because we're essentially acknowledging some form of failure on our own part. We're basically saying, I'm sorry, I didn't do that well enough, or that's my fault, and it's quite self-deprecating. It's very Scottish as well. So it's about how do we move away from a culture of apologising for things to a culture where we actually thank people for things. And I suppose what I mean by that is, when is the last time that you took time to thank a colleague for something small that they'd done? If somebody's helped us out in a massive way, then of course we say thank you. But there's a huge number of opportunities every single day to help build relationships and help develop positive emotions simply by saying thank you. So what I do at this point is I set a little challenge, which is either to send a text message to somebody that they haven't thanked for something that they've done, or if we've got the time and the client's happy for us to do it, it's to sit down to actually write a thank you card to somebody. Now, expressing gratitude through writing has been shown to boost your level of subjective well-being, which is basically how you feel in the moment. It's called subjective well-being because it's very subjective. It can be changed by like getting stuck in traffic, or somebody cuts you off. It can affect your subjective well-being. It's how you feel in the moment. But in order to have a lasting change, writing has been shown to have a much more lasting change on your subjective well-being than simply verbally telling somebody thank you for that. In fact, there was a study which I talk about where they got groups of people to write thank you letters, and then the person either kept that thank you letter, or they posted that thank you letter, or the third group took that thank you letter to the person they were thanking and then read it aloud to that person. And although all three of these conditions impacted the person who'd written the thank you letter in the first place's subjective well-being, it was the third one that had the most significant impact on the long-term subjective well-being of both the writer and the recipient. What's interesting to note about this, though, is that actually the process of writing the letter can be quite emotional. So even though we're doing something in order to boost our level of positive emotions, it can actually have a short-term detrimental impact on how you feel in the moment. And that's because it's actually quite difficult for us to sometimes dig deep and have these moments, I suppose. The other thing that I talk about in terms of boosting subjective well-being, which also links in to accomplishments, which is where I talk about this in much more detail, is how we praise people and how often we say well done and how we praise people's effort. The reason that I mainly talk about this in accomplishments is because it all falls in with Carol Dweck's idea of praising effort over outcome. But I mention it at this point because praise as a leader or as a manager is actually something that we should be doing as often as possible. It's like, the way that I talk about it is, it's like when you're working with a toddler. Even if a toddler's really naughty, if you constantly just tell them off for that bad behaviour, you don't tend to see a change in their behaviour. Whereas if you can catch them being good and praise them for being good and for trying hard and for putting in the effort, then you're more likely to get more of that behaviour. It kind of capitalises on some of the learned helplessness stuff from earlier on, but in a slightly more positive way. So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour of positive emotions. There's a bunch of information in the supporting document as well that comes along with this, but that's pretty much, oh sorry, I just kicked the coffee table out of the way. That's pretty much how I start talking about positive emotions. Right, engagement. Engagement's the easy bit because it's essentially about flow. And we should all know flow inside out. If you haven't read Flow by Csikszentmihalyi, read Flow by Csikszentmihalyi, or just speak to somebody in the team about flow. I I set this bit up slightly differently. I don't actually spend very long talking about engagement because the purpose is to increase engagement. I talk about flow in terms of it being a sort of enhanced state of focus where we feel relaxed, where we feel happy, where time doesn't really seem to matter. But what I essentially say at this point is that engagement is kind of what happens. It's like the outcome of getting everything else right. So if you have high levels of positive emotion, if people have positive relationships, high level of meaning, and feel like they're achieving and being recognised for their achievements, then you're going to increase your level of engagement. I think it's probably a good shout to chuck in an activity at this point. There's a range of different activities that have been tried at this point, and it just quite often depends on what the client has done with us before, exactly what activity goes in here. Hopefully, as we work on this course over the next couple of years, the activities will become set in stone, but currently any activity to do with flow works quite well here, just to get people thinking about, well, what is flow? When do I experience flow? And what are the factors that influence flow. Okay, relationships. So relationships is the R of PERMA and is, I suppose, kind of, particularly from a manager and a leader's point of view, one of the more challenging aspects of dealing with people, because we all know as soon as you are dealing with people, the level of challenge you actually experience increases. So developing positive relationships within your team actually comes down to having a really high level of emotional intelligence. And it's more than just developing self-awareness, it's all really to do with that level of social awareness. So although you can talk about self-awareness and how you understand yourself at this point, it's probably more valuable to make sure that you are up to scratch on all the different stuff to do with social awareness. Social awareness is basically our ability to understand why other people feel the way they feel in different situations. The best managers and leaders will see everything. It doesn't mean that they basically respond to everything, but they will be aware of most things that are going on within their teams. Obviously, the larger your team is, the more challenging this is, which is why developing relationships with line managers and sort of cascading that level of social awareness is really important. If you, for example, are a head of department, then it's going to be very difficult for you to know the exact ins and outs of the relationships with your frontline staff. But if you've got a very good relationship with your maybe support managers below you, the line managers below them, and the line managers below them, and that level of social awareness is high amongst all of you, then you should be able to pick up some of the challenges that you might face before they become challenges. Now, the activity that I use at this point to really develop this this idea of social awareness is the Bridge Challenge. I have attached a copy of the Bridge Challenge to this. I'm sure most of you are probably aware of this. If not, we'll talk you through it. But it's essentially, you have a team of 4 people who are stuck on one side of a gorge. That gorge has got a 500-metre drop. You need to get to the other side of the gorge. It's getting dark, and you need to basically get there as quickly as you can. You've got a torch to cross over the gorge, but it's only got 17 minutes of battery left in it. There is, fortunately, a rope bridge to help you get to the other side, but you can only have 2 people on the bridge at a time. You can only cross the bridge if you have a torch, otherwise you're going to fall to your death. Now, the challenge is that each of the 4 individuals have different levels of injury, which are affecting how long it's going to take them to cross the bridge. So one of you is going to take 1 minute, one of you will take 2 minutes, one of you will take 5 minutes, and one of you will take 10 minutes. Now the challenge is to get everyone across the bridge in the time permitted. Essentially, though, the way I set this up is, what I'd like you to do is see if you can get everyone across the bridge in the time permitted. If not, I want you to tell me who you're leaving behind and why. Now that setup is actually quite important because it helps them to start thinking that there may be another option, and our brain likes shortcuts, so what you tend to do is people will very quickly write off the idea that there's a logical or mathematical solution to the problem, and they'll start coming up with all different sorts of explanations for how they're going to get people across, whether it's piggybacking them, whether it's chucking the torch backwards and forwards, whether it's just sacrificing the person that's going to take the longest. Sort of depending on what they come up with, you can draw out all different sorts of points. One that I quite often come down to is how quickly we just like shake off the brief. So I've asked you to work out if you can get people across. We maybe try 3 or 4 things. It doesn't work, we give up. If you that's not the right word. If you kind of transport that into a business setting, what would happen if we gave up after 3 or 4 attempts of things going wrong? How would that impact your staffing? What if members of your team were only allowed to get stuff wrong 2 or 3 times before they faced disciplinary action? Would that be a positive working environment? How would that feel? All of that kind of thing. The other one is how often we will sacrifice somebody. Quite often people will sacrifice the 10-minute person because they're going to take the longest to cross. Now, although that is true, there is a mathematical solution to this, so you can get everyone across in the time. But in our mind, as soon as we've decided that it's not possible, we tend to look for the weakest link. And once we deal with the weakest link, then we can get everyone else across safely. Thing is, the reason that person might take the longest is because they've broken their ankle or something like that, whereas the 1-minute person might have a massive head bleed, so their legs are working fine and they can get across the bridge okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're stronger or fitter than anyone else. And the solution to this is actually quite straightforward. You take your 1-minute person and your 2-minute person across, you bring your 1-minute person back. You send your 5-minute person and your 10-minute person across, you send your 2-minute person back, then you send your 1-minute and your 2-minute person back across the bridge. The reason that this is so rarely sort of presented as an answer is because it goes against logic to send your 2 slowest members of your team together. Thing is, if you think about it, your 10-minute person is always going to take 10 minutes to cross the bridge. So whether you send a 1-minute person with them or a 5-minute person makes no difference. If you can get rid of the 2 weakest members as quickly as possible, then you're going to have a more positive outcome. Now, when I say get rid of, I don't mean sack. What I mean is, if you pair weaker members of your team together, then you can actually improve their performance. What people tend to do within organisations, if they have, say, a member of the team who's really high flying and somebody who's doing really badly, you will pair your 1-minute person and your 10-minute person together. Now, this actually has a negative impact on both of them. You lose motivation from your 1-minute person, from your high flyer, because they're like, well, why am I wasting my time with this person? Whereas if you pair your 10-minute person with a 1-minute person, then it's an unrealistic expectation. There is no way that you can go from a 10 to a 1 overnight. Whereas if you pair a 10-minute and a 5-minute together, or a poor performer and an average performer together, then it sets a more achievable barrier or boundary for someone to try and raise themselves up to. So it's really about how strategically, as a manager, do you assess the competency of your team. And if you can assess the competency of your team effectively, then you can actually raise everybody's performance. There's a whole link, if you're delivering this within education, this is pretty much where I would talk about closing the attainment gap, and you can't really compare your poorest attainers to your highest attainers. What you need to look at is the attainers just above them, and how do we move them from this level of attainment up to the next one, and so on and so on and so on. But yeah, there's an awful lot comes out of that activity, and the more you run that activity, the more things you'll hear from your audience that hit to just build your level of knowledge. But what it really comes down to is how, as managers and as leaders, do we build effective relationships between us and the people that we're in charge of, but also across our organisations. Hello, hopefully the camera quality is a bit better now because I put the light on. Because it's getting dark outside. So, the next one is meaning. So, meaning, quite often I actually end up discussing meaning quite near the beginning. I'll do eudaimonic happiness and hedonic happiness, and then find myself talking about meaning, because it's quite a natural link from eudaimonic happiness into meaning. The other reason I quite often put it at the beginning is because it helps you to establish why we do what we do. Meaning is generally made up of two separate concepts. First of all, I talk about Simon Sinek's Why Start with Why. So essentially this is to get delegates to think about, well, why does your organisation exist? Why do they do what they do? Why does your team do what they do? And also, why do you do what they do? I focus purely on the why at this point. I maybe mention the how and the what in passing, but I'm much more interested in the why do you choose to do what you do. Once you kind of start to establish that, it makes it much easier to put the rest of it into context. It can also be that kind of penny drop moment for your audience where they might understand why the team exists and they might understand why the organisation exists, but then they go, well, why do I do this? And if their only answer at that point is to pay the bills, then there might actually be something lacking in their motivations for doing the job. Now, we all know there is nothing wrong with doing a job to pay the bills. It's essentially why all of us work, but we can gain so much more out of work. So what would happen if we could increase that level of meaning? For some people, it's as simple as actually maybe I need to go and do something else. But for managers and leaders, one of the challenges that they might face is that their staff don't actually know why the organisation does what it does. Might be able to tell you what they do, but maybe not the motivating purpose behind it. Some examples I give at this point tend to be like Apple, in terms of if you look at their advertising, they very rarely tell you what they're actually selling you, they just tell you why it's going to make your life better. So it's really about, I suppose, looking at organisations from that point of view. I do this as a facilitative exercise where I get them to work in groups, and the 3 questions they're asked are, as I said earlier on, why do you do what you do? Why does your team do what you do? And why do you do what you do? Now, specifically do it in that order because it allows you to get all your corporate jargon out of the way to start with. It's nice to see people's vision statements and mission statements written down, but that's not always the underlying reason that people do what they do. So if you can get all of that out in the kind of first round of facilitation, by the time you get around to, well, why does your team do what you do and why do you do what you do, you actually get much more real answers. Even just by allowing people to discuss these things actually helps them to build the relationships that we were talking about a minute ago, because they actually understand people's motivations for doing what they do. And if you can see eye to eye or understand why somebody does something, then it's actually much easier to understand their behaviour. So it actually helps to increase social awareness. So again, this is directly linked in to what we were talking about earlier on. Right, the second part that I talk about when it comes to meaning comes from Drive. So I show them the Drive video by Dan Pink. There's another book you should read. You've got a lot of reading to do off the back of this course. And it looks at the 3 aspects of motivation, essentially. Once we get beyond sort of financial security, once we're paying people enough that money doesn't really matter anymore, what drives engagement are autonomy, mastery and purpose. So once they've watched that video, they get the chance to reflect on, well, in my role or in our team or in our organisation, what opportunities do we have for autonomy? Which aspects of our role do we get to take control of? Are there areas where we could do more of this? Are there areas where actually we need a bit more guidance? And I talk about autonomy within boundaries, which is basically if you have really clear boundaries of what is acceptable and what you're allowed to take responsibility for, then it's actually easier to then be able to make decisions or know when you need to go to your line manager or whoever it is to get the sign off for stuff. In terms of mastery, we look at, well, what opportunities do you have to learn and develop? Some organisations have great L&D programmes, some have quite poor L&D programmes. Some managers don't actually realise that their staff want to learn new skills, so this can be a really nice way to, again, start to develop that relationship. The other part, autonomy, mastery, purpose, comes back to the why that we were talking about earlier on. So this really allows you to recap what we spoke about in the last section of the video, which I usually do quite near the beginning, and it allows you to start reflecting a little bit more on what those whys actually mean to the individual. Right, I guess the kind of final bit then is the A, it's the accomplishments, which is basically how do we celebrate achievements? How do we recognise when people have done well? How do we praise people for making an improvement in their performance, for improving their behaviour, improving their attitude, and what impact does that have on our overall success? It's very easy to praise somebody for achieving an outcome or hitting a KPI or hitting a target, but that actually can have a very detrimental impact on how motivated people feel. In fact, it can make people quite risk averse. This is all based on Carol Dweck's work in terms of how we use praise effectively to motivate people. And all of her research basically shows that if you only praise how well somebody has done, if you only say, well done, you've hit your target, well done, you've achieved this, then they can become more risk averse, because there's then a fear instilled that, well, what if I don't achieve that the next time? What if I'm not that good the next time? What if something happens and I don't hit that target the next time? So you can actually get people almost setting themselves up for failure at that point. Much more effective use of praise is to praise their effort. In fact, there's a school of thought that says you should never ever praise how well somebody has done, or sort of directly acknowledge how well they've done. Even if somebody's done really well and has hit like a massive target, instead of saying, oh, well done, you've hit that massive target, you should actually say, well done, you have worked incredibly hard this year and now you're reaping the rewards of all of that effort. So it's about how do we constructively use praise, and how does that help us achieve more? Now, the other part of this is about, well, how do we push ourselves and how do we stretch ourselves? If we're already performing at quite a high level, how do you push that to the next level? Now, the activity I've been using at this point is the canyon activity, where they have to pass a bottle across a ever-increasing gap. And essentially, what that shows is that as a team, the more we support each other, whether that's physically, whether that's in terms of sort of developing team resilience, whether that's in terms of our social cohesion and our social bond, whether it's just how much we identify with what it is an organisation is trying to achieve, then we become capable of much, much more. The other option that you can throw in here if they've not worked with us before is the flip chart challenge, which is basically the idea that sometimes we need bigger picture thinking. I quite often talk about the Stanford University, Stanford Prison experiment at this point, where they put a group of psychology students in the basement of the psychology department, and made half of them guards and half of them prisoners. And what they did was they just observed their behaviour. It was basically classic Team A, Team B psychology, which is this idea of quite simply just by identifying with a team means that the way you interact with another team changes. So if I am part of this team, then you are a threat to me because you are not in my team. Whereas as an organisation, we're quite naturally divided into different departments, because we have people who are specialists in finance, we have people who are specialists in a million different things. But collectively, we are one team. And in order to achieve and accomplish things as an organisation and to move forward successfully, we actually need to find ways of breaking down those barriers. So again, that comes down to this idea of developing relationships. So probably what you've worked out already is that every single bit of this content links into the other bits. So whether you're talking about positive emotions or relationships, chances are you're going to be reflecting on how that impacts achievement or accomplishments. It's going to be impacting how much time people are spending in flow, how much they're identifying with the purpose of the organisation. How it's actually strung together really just comes down to the needs of the client. Now, I know that doesn't sound particularly helpful, but that is how it tends to work. There are times where I will start off, once I've done sort of the learned helplessness bit and gone into the hedonic and eudaimonic happiness, I then find myself talking about meaning, and then I jump to positive emotion, and then I jump to building relationships, and then I jump to accomplishments, and then I finish on engagement. Whereas there's other times that the whole thing is set up through engagement. It is really a very malleable course, but if you can get your basic content for each of the 5 sections, then the sort of segues between each of them are so straightforward, because it's, when you think about it, it's not rocket science. And that's what's quite nice about this theory, is it's so relatable. So although it is aimed mostly towards leaders and managers, it's actually quite easy to relate it to any level of staff. It's just about thinking about your stories and how you would do that. So yeah, I guess that's the kind of the bare bones of the content. There is a supporting document that goes along with it. There's also a fairly extensive reading list and watching list, which I'll add on to this. So yeah, if you've got any questions, just ask. Bye.